I want to talk about being a giant. All right? So, who knows who this person is? All right. Okay. Me 20 years ago. No, that's me in 20 years. Yes, when I had, I'm going to get hair plugs. Yeah, this might make it a little bit easier, right? For those, if you didn't hear the shouted out answer or even this, right? Sir Isaac Newton. I like Newton. He's a pretty cool guy. He did a lot of really cool things. One of the things that he did that I really like is he said a lot of really interesting things. So he has a bunch of really cool quotes. This is one of my favorites here. Gravity explains the motion of the planets, but it cannot explain who sets the planets in motion. I really like that one. I find it to be a very faith-promoting quote. This one I also really like. What we know is a drop, but what we don't know is an ocean. Just as true today as it was in his time. Here's another one of my favorites. Tact is the knack of making a point without making an enemy. Thought that was very good. But this is possibly my favorite here. I find this especially true when I'm dealing with my teenagers. But possibly the quote that he's most famous for is, granted he's famous for a lot of things, not quotes, but of the quotes that he is famous for, this is possibly the one he's most famous for. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. You may have recognized that quote and may recognize that it's attributed to Sir Isaac Newton. But what you may not have known is that this is not actually his original concept. The idea of standing on the shoulders of giants was actually coined by this guy, a man named Bernard of Chartres. I have no idea how to pronounce the name of the city. Back in the 12th century, he was a philosopher, an educator, and a bunch of other things. He said a lot of different things, and another educator at the time, John Salisbury, was quoted as saying this about Bernard. Bernard used to compare us to dwarfs perched on the shoulders of giants. He pointed out that we see more and farther than our predecessors, not because we have keener vision or greater height, but because we are lifted up and borne aloft on their gigantic stature. Sir Isaac Newton, of course, then coined that into a far more quotable quote later on, but it was this guy, Bernard of Chartres, who originally had that idea of standing on the shoulders of giants. So let me ask all of you a question. Have you stood on the shoulders of giants? We're all programmers here of some kind, whether or not we are just beginning our career or we've been doing it for 20 plus years or longer. In our jobs, do we stand on the shoulders of giants? Naturally, of course we do. Absolutely. Right? Here. The ground up, yep. Not invented here syndrome. Who knows that one? One of my favorites. We do stand on the shoulders of giants. For example, we aren't doing this today. All right? I think everybody can be glad that we're not doing this. Except for the sad social commentary on the lack of women in our industry that has been a complete flip-flop since programming first started. But thank goodness we're not doing this. So what about this? Who can read this? I got a couple of very impressive hands going up. A few very impressive hands. Yeah, I can read the right-hand column. Right. Totally got half of it down. I can read roughly half of this. Yeah, this is assembly, for those who don't recognize it as assembly. I never learned assembly. I never had any desire to learn assembly. Every time I see assembly, I'm grateful I never learned assembly, and it reiterates in myself the desire never to learn assembly. So these ladies here were the giants that this was built upon. And this is one of the giants that this is built upon. This may look a little more familiar to those here in this room. Here's JavaScript. Anybody can tell me what framework this is? What? Express, yeah. It actually probably could fit with a lot of frameworks. We're going to use very similar methods, but this happens to be Express because line 2 tells us so. But how readable is this in comparison to this, right? And of course, For those of you who are able to read, it is a matter of perspective. For those of you who raised your hands that you could somewhat parse some of this, how about this? Who can parse this? Not very many people, I guess. Those are the shoulders upon which we stand. We also might look at something like this and find it a little bit more familiar, especially in a group like this. Here's a little bit of Angular. So thankfully we write code like this and not like the other two examples. Now I want to speak and talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. I did have some trouble finding good images to kind of evoke this image. So I found this one, but I wasn't really crazy about this one. Then I found this one, which really rang with me because I have a puppy, and I feel like she walks all over me. Then I found this one. I don't even know I don't know what's going on with this one. Obviously not photoshopped. But let's actually, I'm going to go with this one. What's that?
The physics I'll check out.
Yeah, the physics definitely check out here. That's a very common pose for giraffes. I want to focus on this picture here, but we all, if you have heard the quote before about standing on the shoulders of giants, you definitely very much identified with that you are standing on the shoulders of giants. You think it's easy to think about all the amazing tools that we utilize, our editors, our operating systems, all this sort of stuff, right? So we identify with that little person standing there on the top on that shoulder of that giant. But what I want to talk about today is actually a change in perspective. I want to talk about the giant. Yes, it's easy for us to think of ourselves as the dwarf, right? Bernard of Chartres talked about us being the dwarf, us consuming all of the amazing things that others have built for us. But what about being the giant? So, are you a giant?
Is that a fat joke?
That is not a fact joke. You might, if you ask yourself that question, if you do a little bit of introspection, are you a giant? You may decide immediately that the answer is no. I am not a giant. But the reality is you do not have to be this guy. Who knows who this person is? I know one person in the room knows who this person is. What? We got any guesses hazarded? This is Rob Wormald from the Angular team, right? You do not have to be him to be a giant. I had a lot of fun Photoshop. If you don't use Photoshop to Photoshop, can you call it Photoshopping? I'm not sure. But notice the excellent job I did Photoshopping. Very realistic looking. No, you don't have to be this person. You don't have to be Rob. You don't have to be on the Angular team to be a giant. So let's talk for a little bit about what does your app do. All right? Are you a giant based on the app that you're building today? So let's go through that question. What does your app do? And we'll talk about the acceptable answers that mean that you are a giant. The acceptable answers for what does your app do are it either cures cancer, it either stops terrorist attacks, or it rescues trapped puppies, right? Those are the acceptable answers. Yes? No? No. We don't have to be doing these types of things to be a giant, right? I want to tell you a story about my most boring job. It wasn't the job I hated the most. When I was a kid, I worked at a call center, and I hated that job so much, this is not an exaggeration, I literally would pray and ask God to burn down the building so that I didn't have to go to work. I hated the job that much. That is not an exaggeration. I seriously had those prayers when I was 16 or 17 or so when I worked that job. I hated that job. But I had a very boring job about 10, 12 years ago. I worked at a company that built this app that I could not care less about. It was the most boring app in the entire world. And when people asked me, what I did, and I said I was a programmer, and they asked what the company does, I told them where I worked, and they asked what the company does, and I explained it. I would always preface this with, even I think this is boring, so you don't have to feign interest in what we do. I just thought it was a horrid job, and it was a horrid app, and I didn't like anything about it, other than the pay. But the reality was, it was not a stupid app. It was actually a highly important app. But my vision was lacking. Let me tell you about what we built. We built medical auditing software. Okay, I've done a lot of work in the medical field, and so not the kind of work where you save lives, the kind of work where you write code. I'd done a lot in health informatics, and so this job came up, and I took this job. It seemed like a good job, and what they did was they built this auditing software that would go through and look at insurance records, and it would look for patterns of fraud, right? And they'd come up, and they'd have these fraud auditors that would maybe dig into stuff deeper, and then they'd look for fraud. So it was medical, and it was accounting, right? Those were the two keywords that, if I were to pick from all the keywords that would bore me to death, medical and accounting would be the two that would come right up. So I thought it was super boring and not a big deal. But I didn't have proper vision. This software saved millions and millions and millions of dollars, right? And when there are more dollars in the medical system, that in general will translate to better care, and better care translates to lives being saved, right? That was a vision I lacked. I didn't see that in this software. I didn't see that ultimately this translated to keeping criminals away from the dollars that could instead be spent on medical procedures, medical research, all that sort of stuff. I did not have that vision. There is a very interesting story, one that I had not heard, maybe you have heard this, about our President John F. Kennedy. So one day he was walking around at NASA, and he encountered a janitor, and he asked the janitor he says, "What are you doing?" And he didn't ask it like that. He kind of was kindly inquisitive about what his job was and what he did. And his response was, by the way, who knows who this janitor is? Only one hand? This is from, oh, okay, a few. This is one of the best sitcoms, right? Scrubs. Anyway, he asked this janitor, he says, "What are you doing?" And the janitor's response was just, in my opinion, earth-shattering. He says, the janitor at NASA, he responds and says, "I'm helping to put a man on the moon." Now that is vision, right? If you haven't heard that story, you may have heard a similar story about St. Paul's Cathedral, that the architect, while it was being built, was walking around and asked three different laborers what they were doing. And the first laborer said, I'm cutting bricks, right? And the second laborer said, "I'm making three pence a day." And then the third laborer answered and said, "I'm helping to build a beautiful cathedral," right? It is our vision that can really determine both our engagement at our job, but just an understanding of what it is that we are doing, how we can be a giant. Now, being a giant is not just about code. It isn't just about your jobs, right? It's about the teaching that you do. It's about the supporting of other people that you do. It's about even your spending. What you spend your money on is also an aspect of helping other people, the donations that you make and the good things that you do with your money. So if we turn this question around of are you a giant on its head, instead let's ask the question, how can you become a giant? Right? So the first simplest answer is learning. If we learn, we are preparing ourselves for what's next. We are expanding our reach, in fact. Our capability to make an impact is directly correlated to the things that we have learned to do. If I learn to use a shovel, and my job is I need to dig a hole, I have a fairly limited impact. But if I learn to use a piece of heavy excavation equipment, my impact can be much greater. So as we sit here in this room and we learn, granted this is not code, but there will be other presentations that are about code. As we sit here in this room and learn, as we go home and we do a little bit of playing around and practicing, as we are at our jobs and we take a few minutes to read the documentation about something, as we learn, we are creating ourselves, our stature, we are raising our stature, increasing our stature, and becoming taller. The apps that we built, right? Some of us build tools that other people use. Where's the lucid chart guy? Right? That guy back there, he builds a tool. Many of you might also build tools that others use to build things. We might build apps that help a business do something, like the app that I was building, right? It wasn't a tool for other people to use. It was a tool for us to use to create a business that did something very positive. Your apps might improve life, right? And they might make something easier to do, so that if something's easier to do, it can be done quicker, and that gives people more time to do whatever it is that's more important to them, right? If you're working on the UX of your banking app and you make it take a little bit less time to make a transfer, right? You are saving maybe one person just a few seconds, but over the course of the thousands of people who use your app thousands of times, you might be saving a lot of time that can go into doing more important things in life. Community, right? Meetups, for example. Attending a meetup, just attending a meetup is a big deal. Ken and I and Walter do not enjoy coming into a room that has nobody in it, right?
Should have paused longer before you said that.
Walter does enjoy that. Sorry. Ken and Walter and I do not enjoy that, right? We spend the time that we spend on this meetup for people to actually benefit from, right? So attendance, just showing up at a meetup makes a big deal. It creates a camaraderie, a sense of community. The bigger the meetup is, the more vital it seems, right? So just attending a meetup by itself is a way to build the community around you and to stand a little bit taller. Going to conferences. Well, let me back up. Contributing at meetups is like the next step. Giving talks at meetups. Helping to organize meetups. Helping to find sponsors for meetups or sponsoring meetups. Our SDG lady took off, so I can't thank her again, but these sorts of things. Conferences, right? Your company may sponsor conferences. You may attend conferences. All of that builds up the community. I run NGConf. Okay, we have 1,500 people that show up, and they get an amazing experience that they have to pay for. But what they may not realize is most of them, it's not their money they're shelling out, their boss's money they're shelling out. But as they shell out their boss's money for that ticket, what they don't realize is the actual product of NGConf is not for the speakers to get a free flight to Salt Lake. It's not for Alex to get to come in and have a nice dinner a couple of nights with his team. It's really not for them. Even though they might be paying for themselves to go, the real product that comes out of it is none of those things. What the attendees get, what the speakers get, what the organizers get. It is the videos that are produced, that are put up on YouTube, that are seen hundreds of thousands of times every year. Right? That knowledge that gets spread around the world, that is the true product of a conference like NGConf. And those tickets that they buy, just the attendees, help contribute to that. Obviously, you can do other things. You can help organize conferences. Utah.js always needs people that are willing to do more than just show up. Volunteer to do work, volunteer to actually help organize. Let me tell you a little secret, right? Ken and Walter and I don't want to hold the Meetup and Utah.js close and tied in and not let anybody else be a part of it, right? We want and need people that will step up and say, I will make a commitment and I will take care of a task, right? Long ago, Ken wasn't involved in this, and I wasn't involved in this, and Walter wasn't involved in this, and we just decided that we were going to take responsibility for this stuff, right? There was no magic sauce. Nobody elected us. Did anybody elect you? Nobody elected me.
Ken elected him co-founders.
But no election, right? Well, I was not a co-founder. Nobody elected me. I just started doing stuff. And Ken and Kip, they were happy to let me do lots of things, right? Conferences, support and encouragement of other people in the community, right? We can do this online. We can do this here. Encouraging other people to get educated, to go to schools, that sort of thing. Inclusiveness, right? As we don't tolerate exclusivity, but instead do the things that make an inclusive environment, right? As we treat people from underrepresented groups exactly the same as we treat those in the majority represented groups. That improves inclusiveness, that makes us stand a little bit taller. As we give our time and energy to organizations that focus on inclusivity, right? We stand a little bit taller. Finally, being accepting and non-judgmental in the community, kind of related to some of these other last couple, but I would say this by itself deserves special mention, especially when you consider the times when you fundamentally disagree with somebody, right? We have an opportunity. Has anybody, well, a lot of you probably haven't seen this, but I've spent a lot of time on Twitter, and occasionally I will see a negative comment on Twitter. Maybe none of you have seen that before. That's a very dry humor. Right, Twitter is just a hellhole of garbage, right? But it's only a hellhole of garbage because of the things that people say on Twitter, right? We don't have to say bad stuff on Twitter or in any other forum where we can be accepting and non-judgmental of other people, especially when we fundamentally disagree with them. Teaching others, right? Writing blogs, putting out videos, sitting down with our peers, pair programming, teaching our peers something that we've learned, doing lunch and learns at work, teaching actual classes, getting up at meetups and speaking. All these sorts of things let us stand a little bit taller. Contributing to open source, right? Just creating good issues. When you find, actually reporting an issue at all can oftentimes be a huge thing. Don't report anything to the CLI. They're full on issues. Right, Alex?
If there's still a bug, you should report it.
But writing good issues, okay? Putting together all the information that you possibly can. Not just getting on and complaining, right? This thing sucks because it takes 2 seconds longer than I want it to take. That is not an issue.
Minimal repro, please.
Minimal reproduction, right? GitHub repos or gists that show the problems, those sorts of things. Giving feedback on open source, that's a big thing right there. I've run a couple of very small open source projects, and just getting people to look at some of these projects and spend time with it and come back and say, I like the way this worked, and I didn't like the way that this works, and I think it would be improved if you did this. Helping out with documentation, actually doing pull requests and actually contributing in that manner, or even maintaining an actual open source project and becoming a maintainer upon it and spending some of your time. Right? So much amazing stuff has been done by people who just decided to spend their time coding on something they were never going to get paid for. So how can we ourselves, once we get that stature, how can we ourselves be a giant? The reality is that no matter where you are at in your career and in your life, there are times when you are a giant, right? Sometimes we're the dwarf standing on top of somebody's shoulders, but sometimes we are the giant. So when we are the giant, how should we behave? The first step is to have vision, right? Vision can be a lot of things, but I would say when it comes to being a giant, vision is seeing things in the right perspective, seeing people as people, seeing the best in others, seeing their positives and not their negatives. That sort of vision causes you to contribute to the community as a whole, causes you to stand a little bit taller. When you're a giant, this is not the kind of giant we want to be, right? So avoiding behaviors that discourage others. There's been several different articles and blog posts and Twitter threads that I've read about horror stories that women have had in the industry, right? Not contributing to that type of behavior, but instead, or anything else that you can do to discourage other people, whether that's the myth of the genius programmer. When you're the senior developer and everybody looks up to you and thinks, man, there's no way I could ever be as good as that person. I don't know how they know everything that they know, right? Be vulnerable. Let them know let other people know when you struggle to learn things, when you struggle with your own vulnerabilities, your own issues. We think that our vulnerabilities make us weak, but they don't. Our vulnerabilities allow us to bond to other people, right? So showing our vulnerabilities is part of that. And treating the differences between ourselves and others as diversity and not as right or wrong, right? Even differences of opinion, and especially things of which we fundamentally disagree. There will be times when people will adore you. And when that happens, I heard a quote that I've definitely struck me, and that is, always be grateful, but don't drink it in, right? The junior developers on your team that look up to you, your kids, whatever it is, when it's the people out in the audience when you're giving a talk, it's always be grateful for that, but never drink it in. I will end and summarize with a great quote, which I very much enjoy. I think is a summary of what I'm trying to get across. That the true measure of a person, excuse my spelling error, is how they treat someone who can do them absolutely no good. Thanks very much for your time.